Tonight, as the shadows lengthen and the world beyond your window whispers the night's secrets, I bring you a tale from the darkened rows of an old movie theater, where the flicker of the screen isn't the only thing to watch you from the darkness. This is a story of forgotten whispers and lingering presences. So, lock your doors, dim your lights, and prepare to glance over your shoulder. Our story begins in the small town of Elmswood, a place just like any other, with one exception: an old, single-screen movie theater known as the Grand. The Grand had stood since the 1920s, a relic of golden-era glamour, now faded, much like the town itself. It was run by an elderly man, Mr. Hendricks, who had owned it since the 60s. Locals said he was as much a part of the theater as the antique projectors or the velvet seats, perhaps even more so. One chilly October evening, a local teenager named Sarah and her friends decided to catch a midnight horror show at the Grand. The feature was an old classic, Night of the Living Dead. As the group settled into the creaky seats, the dim room filled with the scent of stale popcorn and dust, the film began to roll, its black and white scenes casting eerie shadows across the walls. As the movie played, Sarah felt an uneasy sensation, as if they were being watched. She whispered her fears to her friend, Jake, who laughed it off, chalking it up to the ambience and the movie's effect. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling. Halfway through the movie, she stood up to go to the restroom. Walking down the aisle, she heard its soft, barely audible whispers. They seemed to come from all around her, yet no one else was in sight. Upon her return, she noticed an extra figure sitting in the back row, still, silent, and unnervingly out of place. She blinked, and it was gone. She returned to her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. The movie neared its climax, and the whispers grew louder. Sarah's mind raced with panic as she felt cold air brush against her neck. She turned around to see the empty seat behind her, but this time, there was a brief flicker of a figure, an apparition of a man, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his eyes hollow, his stare piercing through the dim light. Frozen in fear, she could only watch as the figure slowly faded, the whispers quieting with his departure. The movie ended, and the lights flickered on, chasing away the shadows. Sarah and her friends hurriedly left the theater, the echoes of the whispers still ringing in her ears. The next day, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, Sarah returned to the Grand. She confronted Mr. Hendricks, who, after a moment of hesitation, revealed a forgotten tale. Many years ago, a man named Thomas Whitmore, the original owner, had mysteriously disappeared after closing the theater one night. His body was never found, and locals whispered that his spirit lingered, forever bound to the theater he loved so much. Sarah left the Grand, the weight of the story settling in her heart. She knew that every time she passed by the old theater, she would remember the whispers in the dark, and that she was never truly alone when she sat in those ancient, velvet seats. Let me tell you a story about the Regal Theater, down on Elm Street. Now, the Regal was never anything fancy. Sticky floors, popcorn clinging to every surface, the kind of place you went for a cheap thrill, not a five-star experience. But on that particular Tuesday night, it offered a thrill more terrifying than anyone could have bargained for. I was working concessions, bored out of my skull as usual. The movie was some low-budget sci-fi flick, barely a blip on the radar. The theater was practically empty, just me, the projectionist, old man Henderson, and maybe a handful of stragglers scattered throughout the place. Around halfway through the movie, the lights went out. Now, that wasn't unusual. Happens all the time. But this time, the backup generator didn't kick in. The theater plunged into an inky blackness, broken only by the faint red exit signs. A ripple of nervous laughter went through the audience. Then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the silence. It wasn't the kind of scream you hear in a movie. It was raw, primal, filled with a terror that seeped into your bones. Panic started to set in. People were bumping into each other, yelling for someone to get the lights back on. I grabbed my flashlight and headed towards the projection booth, figuring old man Henderson might know what was going on. The hallway was like a tomb, shrouded in darkness. My heart hammered against my ribs as I inched my way forward. the beam of the flashlight a tiny oasis in the vast black. Finally, I reached the projection booth door. It was ajar, a sliver of light escaping from inside. I pushed it open, calling out for Henderson. Silence. The projector whirred to life behind me, casting a ghostly glow on the room. An empty film reel lay abandoned on the counter. The projector screen, however, wasn't blank. There was something moving on it. Grainy, distorted figures writhed on the screen, their faces contorted into expressions of pure agony. A sound, a low, guttural growling filled the booth, vibrating in my chest. I whipped around, frantically searching for the source. There, in the corner, huddled in the shadows, was Old Man Henderson. But it wasn't Henderson anymore. His face was a grotesque mask of terror, eyes bulging, mouth stretched into a silent scream. He pointed a trembling finger at the screen. The figures on the film, they were moving towards me. I can tell you what happened next. My mind just shut down. The next thing I remember, the lights were back on. People were filing out, confused and shaken. I was a gibbering mess, huddled on the floor, staring at the spinning film reel. They found Old Man Henderson later that night, crumpled up in the back row, dead. The police never did figure out what happened. The footage on the film, well, let's just say it was too disturbing for public viewing, ended up getting locked away somewhere in the depths of the police station archives. But here's the thing, folks. Sometimes, when the city goes quiet on a Tuesday night, and the wind howls just right, I swear I hear that low growl echoing down Elm Street. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when I close my eyes, I still see those figures. Those figures moving towards me. Tonight, I offer you a journey into the depths of an abandoned movie palace where the past is not as silent as one might hope. Our story, Whispers in the Dark, follows young Marcus, whose fascination with urban exploration brings him face to face with forgotten horrors. Marcus, a bold and thrill-seeking journalism student from New Orleans, often chased stories and adventures that others shied away from. One evening, amidst the clatter of a college cafe, a friend dared him to explore the old Majestic Theater downtown, closed since the 80s and the center of all sorts of ghostly legends. With only his phone's flashlight and a camera, Marcus stepped into the darkness of the Majestic, its grandeur buried under layers of dust and decay. The silence was thick, broken only by the echo of his footsteps and the occasional drip of water. In the heart of the theater, Marcus found the main auditorium. The air was cooler here, the velvet seats coated in dust, the stage curtains tattered. He noticed a projection booth above, seemingly untouched. On a whim, he climbed up to see if the old equipment still worked. To his surprise, the power was on. A reel was already loaded onto the ancient projector, as if waiting for him. Curious, Marcus flipped a switch, and the machine spittered to life, casting flickering light onto the large, empty screen. As the film played, it showed scenes of the theater itself, from its opening days to slowly, more disturbing images. Shadowy figures in the seats, faces contorted in fear, a dark figure pacing the aisles. The camera angle was eerily similar to Marcus's own viewpoint from the booth. The whispers began softly, nearly drowned out by the film's crackles. They grew louder, more insistent, calling his name, Marcus, down here. Driven by a mix of dread and intrigue, Marcus stepped out of the booth, looking down into the sea of seats. As he looked down, the figures in the film seemed to stare right back at him, their eyes pleading. The whispering became a cacophony, and Marcus felt an icy grip of fear. The figure he'd seen pacing in the film now stood on the stage, its face hidden in shadow, its hand beckoning to him. Marcus, frozen with fear, watched as the figure pointed up towards the projection booth. Turning around, he saw the film now displayed a new scene, the very booth he had just left, as the shadowy figure slowly climbed the stairs towards it. In a panic, Marcus fled down the aisles, the whispers chasing him, echoing through the vast, empty theater. He burst through the exit doors into the night, the cold air hitting his face, the eerie silence of the outside world overwhelming after the terror inside. Marcus never returned to the Majestic Theater, and it was demolished later that year. But the footage he captured on his camera was gone, replaced by static. The whispers in the dark remain a mystery, a chilling reminder that some places keep their secrets, no matter how deeply we probe. You settle in tonight, remember the story of Marcus and the Majestic Theater, and listen closely because sometimes the dark whispers back. It all went down last Friday night at the old Beacon Theater. Now, the Beacon wasn't exactly a five-star joint. Sticky floors, popcorn that tasted suspiciously like burnt rubber, the kind of place you went for cheap thrills, not champagne wishes. But hey, it was showing a double feature of cult classics, and the price was right. So, I grabbed my buddy, Mark, and we headed out for a night of cheesy scares. The place was practically deserted. A handful of scattered patrons, and a grumpy-looking old man behind the concession counter. We settled in for the first movie, a grainy sci-fi flick so bad it was almost good. About halfway through, the projector sputtered and died. The theater plunged into darkness, the only sound the nervous coughs and shuffling of feet. "Great," Mark muttered, whipping out his phone flashlight. "Just what I needed. A technical difficulty in the middle of a B-movie alien invasion." Before anyone could complain, a single light flickered on at the back of the theater. It wasn't the usual overhead light, but a dim spotlight illuminating a single seat. And sitting in that seat, well, let's just say it wasn't someone I recognized. It was a woman, shrouded in darkness except for the stark white of her evening gown. Her hair cascaded down her back in a wave of silver, and her face. Something was wrong with her face. It was pale, almost unnaturally so, and her eyes, they were completely black, like bottomless pits staring into your soul. A shiver ran down my spine. There was something unsettling about her, an aura of pure wrongness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Suddenly, the woman stood up, her movements fluid and graceful. She began to walk towards the front of the theater, her white gown whispering against the floor. The spotlight followed her like a macabre beacon. The remaining patrons watched, mesmerized. Even Mark, his usual bravado forgotten, seemed speechless. As she reached the aisle directly in front of us, she stopped. Her black eyes locked onto mine, and a smile spread across her pale face. It wasn't a friendly smile, but a chilling, predatory grin that sent a wave of terror through me. Then, in a voice that sounded like dry leaves rustling in the wind, she spoke. "1 ticket," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. My heart hammered against my ribs. What did she mean? What ticket? My eyes darted around the theater, searching for a clue, but there was nothing. Before I could answer, the woman spoke again, this time her voice laced with a hint of impatience. "1 ticket, please," she repeated, extending a bony hand towards me, palm outstretched, for the final show. In her hand, glinting under the spotlight, was a single ticket stub. It was old and faded, the paper worn thin with age, but the words printed on it were clear enough. The last show. A cold dread filled me. This was no ordinary movie theater, and this woman, she wasn't human. A primal fear took hold, an instinct screaming at me to run. But before I could move, before Mark could ask a question, the woman's smile widened. This time, it wasn't a grin. It was a grotesque rictus that stretched impossibly wide across her face. Then, with a deafening crack, the floor beneath her seat gave way. The woman, the spotlight, everything vanished, swallowed by a gaping hole that opened in the darkness. A blood-curdling scream erupted from the back of the theater, a sound laced with pure terror. It was short-lived, cut off abruptly as the darkness seemed to pulsate, as if it were consuming something. Panic erupted. People scrambled for the exits, pushing and shoving in the blinding darkness. Mark grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "We gotta get out of here," he yelled. We pushed through the panicked crowd, adrenaline fueling our escape. It felt like an eternity before we finally reached the exit, the heavy doors swinging open to reveal the cool night air. We didn't stop running until we were blocks away, lungs burning, chests heaving. Neither of us spoke for a while, simply trying to catch our breath, to process the bizarre and terrifying experience. The next day, the news reported a gas leak at the Beacon Theater. They said a faulty pipe had ruptured, causing the floor to collapse. No mention of the strange woman. No mention of the chilling ticket stub that I clutched in my sweaty palm. It had somehow escaped my notice in the chaos of the escape. Now, under the harsh light of day, it seemed even more nonsensical. But the memory of the woman's black eyes and her predatory grin remained etched in my mind. Mark called me a few hours later, his voice shaken. Apparently, he hadn't left the theater immediately. He said he saw a flicker of movement in the darkness where the floor had opened. A glimpse of something white, disappearing into the abyss. We both knew what it was. The ticket stub wouldn't leave me alone. It felt like a cursed object, pulsating with an unseen energy. Every time I looked at it, I felt a sense of dread, a pull towards something dark and unknown. I tried to throw it away, but my hand always hovered above the trash can, an invisible force stopping me. One night, a strange dream invaded my sleep. It wasn't a dream, not exactly. It was more like a vision. I found myself back in the Beacon Theater, the spotlight shining on the empty seat where the woman had been. Then, the image shifted, and I was looking down into the darkness below the floor. There, among swirling shadows, I saw a multitude of faces, all pale and distorted, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They were chanting, their voices a low, guttural chorus that sent shivers down my spine. And then, I heard it, a single word, repeated over and over again. The show. I woke up with a gasp, sweat clinging to my skin. The ticket stub was clutched in my hand, the paper cold and damp. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I went back to the Beacon Theater. It was a shell of its former self, boarded up and tagged with graffiti. But through a gap in the boards, I could see the gaping hole in the floor. With trembling hands, I approached the hole and leaned over, peering into the darkness. A cold gust of air rushed up, carrying with it a faint whisper that sounded like the chanting from my dream. Taking a deep breath, I closed my eyes and tossed the ticket stub into the darkness. A moment of silence, then a deafening roar erupted from below. It was a sound of pure rage and frustration, the sound of something being denied. The roar faded, replaced by an eerie quiet. Slowly, I opened my eyes. The air was still, the whispers gone. A sense of relief washed over me, but it was mixed with a lingering unease. I haven't been back to the Beacon Theater since. Sometimes, at night, I think I hear faint chanting coming from somewhere far away. And on particularly quiet nights, I swear I can feel a cold presence watching me from the darkness. Maybe the story ends here. Maybe I managed to get rid of whatever evil lurked beneath the Beacon Theater. Or maybe the show hasn't ended yet. Maybe it's just waiting for the next unsuspecting soul with a ticket to attend. Maybe it's waiting for you. Most importantly, remember to stay safe, and to always trust your instincts. And if you enjoyed hearing about my brush with the supernatural, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more spine-tingling tales of terror. Until next time, stay vigilant, my friends.